Let's get nostalgic. We're going to look back on the top 15 wide receivers from the 2023 fantasy football season on today's episode of the Fantasy Football Fellas podcast. Welcome in. I am back. I wish I had, guess who's back? I wish I had Shady queued up right now, but I don't. And that we frankly would get flagged for copyright on that. Lucas Wenzel, I am back. Cameron Lawrence and Tyler Plath, all three fellas hanging out with you today. Fellas, it is good to be back. I have been traveling. I have been moving. You have been holding down the fort. Thanks for holding it down while I've been gone.
It's good to have you back. I don't have to host anymore. I got to save my words. They're carry more weight now.
Cameron, you are an exceptional host. Don't be so self-deprecating.
I didn't want to say we were taking a step back with Lucas coming back, but I'm glad you did. So thank you.
I mean, I was gonna say, my back finally got a break now that I was in Florida. It felt nice. I could feel my back releasing tension. I was in a lawn chair and sitting out in the sun reading my book. Oh, it was wonderful to not have that. No, it is good to be back with you too. We are going to break down and recap the good, the bad, and the ugly from the top 15 wide receivers from the 2023 fantasy football season. If you're not subscribed to the podcast already, make sure you do that and make sure you turn on those notifications as well when you subscribe so you know when all of our new episodes are up. And same over on YouTube. We're down only 2 videos a week, but it's the off season, right? We're taking a step back as well, but we're going to bring you content every single week. Make sure you subscribe, turn on notifications over there as well. Fellas, we have 15 wide receivers to cover. We got a lot of good, a lot of bad, and plenty of ugly to cover in this episode. So let's not keep the people waiting. Let's dive on in and recap the top 15 wide receivers in fantasy football from 2023. So just as a reminder, when Cameron and Ty, they did the top 15 running backs last week, when we talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly for all of these players, the good is fairly self-explanatory, right? What are the good things that this player did this season? What contributed to their success? What were some notable things as we're grinding through the numbers here? What stood out to us as good? The bad isn't necessarily something that was bad. That's kind of what we reserve the ugly for. But like, for instance, like touchdown numbers, if touchdowns didn't fall a player's way, like that's something that would be considered bad. But clearly they're still in the top 15, so something went right for them. But just things that could be improved upon. And then the ugly is obviously just like, oh my gosh, like this is something we need to look at more into the offseason. This is something we need to consider going into next year. Like what went absolutely wrong and really contributed to the pitfalls of said player. But let's start at 15. We're going to work our way from 15 all the way down to 1. And coming in at wide receiver 15 this year in PPR formats was San Francisco 49ers wide receiver Deebo Samuel. And there was, when Deebo was on the field, he was awesome this year. So Ty, why don't you give us the good, the bad, and the ugly of Deebo Samuel?
Deebo kind of made us look a bit foolish, I think, because we all looked at the
I led that charge.
Well, I was kind of on board with it though too, because
I was too. I'll take some blame for that as well.
Like there was nothing really from last year's numbers that made you really excited going into the season, right? You were hoping for a lot of rushing production, and eventually you kind of got it. And he also did pretty well in the receiving game as well. I mean, he was 9th in yards after the catch. He was 4th in total touchdowns. He was a top 12 wide receiver in fantasy points per game and in yards per route run, the holy grail of all metrics, right, for receivers. He was 8th in target separation, 2nd in fantasy points per route, 1st in fantasy points per game, or per target, I should say. And those last two aren't really any, stats that we can really draw anything from. It's really just taking two stats and combining them. But, there were some ups and then there were some downs, in the bad, like you said, Lucas. They're more so just kind of disappointments more than they are like something bad, right? But when you look at some of his advanced metrics for Deebo, right, it's 69th in routes ran. He was 57th in route participation. But to be completely honest, like that's par for the course when it comes to right. Deebo Samuel, right? He is so, he's so heavily utilized in other ways that a receiver isn't. He's going to take a dip in routes and participation and stuff like that. So it's not necessarily like it's something bad, but you look at it and you're like, what if we bump that up just a touch. What happens, right? But then the ugly for Deebo is that he really kind of disappeared in the middle part of the season for you. And either you traded him away or you started losing so much because of him. I shouldn't say because of him, but a part of the reason why you were losing so much in the middle of your season, because first 3 weeks, he was the wide receiver 8, averaging 19.5 fantasy points per game. Awesome. Weeks 12 to 18, right? Wide receiver 2, averaging 21 fantasy points per game. Awesome. But like I said, the middle part of the season, weeks 4 to 11, he's the wide receiver 74, averaging only 7.7 fantasy points per game. And he did miss 2 games in that stretch. So that was kind of, hopefully he didn't ruin your season completely. But at the same time, a stretch from week 4 to 11, that's what, 7 games, 8 games? It's kind of brutal. It's tough to come back from. So look, Deebo had some really good things to his season. He also had some really disappointing things to his season. But for a top 15 wide receiver, it's kind of I don't know if fitting is the right way to say it, but we're talking about a top 15 wide receiver. He had a good season.
Right. Well, so I think that's the point, though, is that Deebo's season could have been a lot better. Like that's what's scary about this, because you look at his stretch, 4 to 11, like you said. I mean, week 4, he only put up 0.6 against Arizona. He played the entire game. You can, if you really want to scratch week 6, you can, because he only played 15% of the snaps before leaving with injury, and then week 10, obviously only 56% as he's coming back from injury. So yeah, the injury kind of played into that, but that's what's scary is Deebo's season could have been a lot better as well. And you brought up the routes and the route participation as well. I mean, again, this is what we know about Deebo Samuel. He is just hyper efficient. You get the ball into his hands in Kyle Shanahan's offense where he can make a play happen in space. I mean, that's his bread and butter. Like, I don't think Deebo is ever going to be this guy who's going to be, top 25 in routes run, route participation. Maybe he will be, but this year especially, I mean, he was just so hyper efficient with the opportunities that he was given, and he ran away with them. Cameron, well, let's talk about another 49ers wide receiver, because you're going to talk about Brandon Ayiuk, who came in at the wide receiver 14. He and Deebo finished back to back. Good, the bad, and the ugly of Brandon Ayiuk. Let's start with the good.
Yeah, so he, on the season, 75 catches, 105 targets, 1,342 yards, and 7 tutties. That's really good as a 5th-round pick from, what you want to see. He had 17.4 yards per catch, which was pretty close to top in the league. Pickens had the highest in the league at 18.1. So he was right up there. And he was 7th in yards on the season, despite only 75 receptions. In weeks 10 through 17, so after the bye, he was wide receiver 6 at 16.8 points per game, which I think is something to note, because Deebo was great during the same stretch as well. Yep. CMC was good during that same stretch as well, right? It was just the 49ers were clicking. But the bad, and this is what we talked about at the beginning of the season with all 49ers players, is just the volume. It's similar to Deebo. He was 30th in targets and 53rd in routes run. It's the fact that this is Christian McCaffrey's team, and then everybody else has to kind of file in after. So Kittle, right? He had 1,000 yards receiving, but his targets and his receptions were still down. Deebo, targets, receptions still down. Ayiuk, targets and receptions down. It just happened to work out that this 49ers offense was so unbelievably efficient that, they all got the yards. They all scored touchdowns. So all of them were still good for fantasy. But it is a little nerve-wracking going into next year of, can this team maintain this level of efficiency, or all 4 of their, top players, I guess these three receiving options outside of McCaffrey, can they maintain how good they have been? And the ugly for Ayiuk, kind of like Deebo, is it's just when you have this little amount of volume, you are going to be a little more inconsistent. So not counting week 18, which he was outside the top 30, but in 6 of his 15 weeks, he was outside the top 30, and 5 of those 15 weeks, he was inside the top 20, right? So he was only a top 20 wide receiver in a third of his weeks. So he was more of an average to below average wide receiver on a weekly basis. He was just consistent enough and had good enough boom weeks to kind of carry him into this top 14. So he wasn't necessarily like a guy that was winning you a week each week, but he didn't really lose you weeks either at the same time.
And I think that's what we're going to see as we continue to progress through these until we get to really like wide receivers 8, 7, even, where then we'll finally start to see like, oh, okay, these guys were a lot more consistent. I think a lot of these guys who are sliding in the 9 to 15 range, they gave you enough really, really good weeks where you're forced into starting them every single week. But then their lows were pretty low as well. And I think that was the case with Brandon Ayiuk this year. Ty, what else do you want to chip in here?
I was just going to say something along those same lines. I mean, we either other wide receivers were dealing with quarterback issues, injuries themselves. Like you look at guys, I mean, Justin Jefferson is probably the first name that comes to mind, right? I mean, he missed 8 games on the 7 games. Sorry, 7 games on the year. And so he's then in the 30s. Jalen Waddle, I mean, he was in the 30s. Garrett Wilson, with all the expectations he had with Rodgers, DK Metcalf, a step back with Geno, right? Like those are some of the names that you would expect to see in that 9 to 15 range. But for other reasons in their season, that's why we're finding a Deebo Samuel, a Brandon Ayiuk, and some of these other guys in those spots because they were consistent enough or they just played more games.
Well, I mean, I mentioned lack of consistency, but I'm going to transition us right into the wide receiver 13, who I think, let's be honest, like Michael Pittman Jr. might have been the staple of consistency this year. So, you look at 109 receptions, 156 targets, 1,152 yards. Those are all career highs for Michael Pittman. And when you look at that line, maybe outside of the 1,100 yards, you'd hope that'd be in like the 1,400 yard range. You're thinking like, that dude was the definition of consistent. He had a 30.5% target share this year. That was 4th of all wide receivers, and that was nearly a 5% increase from his previous career high of 25.7% target share. So this man, like, clear alpha in the Indianapolis Colts offense. I know there was a stint of like 3 weeks where you're like, Josh Downs working his way in, and then Josh Downs just became non-existent. So that's a good with Michael Pittman. I mean, clear alpha 156 targets. Clearly one of the top target getters in the NFL this year. He has earned those targets. The bad is like Michael Pittman is a big short, not short yardage. I don't want to say that. He's a big yak guy, and all the advanced metrics point to that. You would hope for a few more big explosive down the field plays, but like 25th in air yards, he only ran 2.08 yards per route. That was 23rd in the league this year. His average depth of target was 86th. He only saw 7.9 yards. Again, 10th in yak. So that eliminates, this discrepancy of seeing such a short yardage average depth of target. But then you look at his dominator rating with how many targets, with how many yards he racked up. Dominator rating takes the percentage of team yards and touchdowns, and it basically accumulates the percentage of how much Michael Pittman contributed to that. He was 30th in dominator rating, 26.8%. I don't love that. Considering he was the alpha in Indianapolis, I would expect a little bit more out of that. Again, just things that I'm flagging as bad that I think could be improved upon in future years. But the ugly with Michael Pittman is very obvious. He only scored 4 touchdowns. That is the ugly. I know I use that as an example of bad, but if Pittman really wants to take that next step, to be a top 8 to 12 alpha guy in fantasy football, he has to score more than 4 touchdowns. I mean, that's just inexcusable for him to only have 4 touchdowns on the volume that he had. I mean, four touchdowns on 109 receptions. Like that's just not a good number. So that's what's going to put him over the top, is if he increases on these touchdowns. That's what's going to put him ahead of, I mean, you look at the guys in 10, 11, 12, even 9 on this list. If Michael Pittman scores 3 more touchdowns this year, we're talking about him as a top 10 fantasy wide receiver. So the good, the bad, and the ugly. Pittman, big target hog, clear number 1 guy in Indy. The bad is just the role. You want to see more, opportunity for downfield explosive plays, just not getting that. But again, that's just who Michael Pittman is as a wide receiver. And the ugly is, my gosh, that man cannot find the end zone. Someone give him a touchdown or 2 extra next year, because that's really what's going to put him over the top if he continues to sustain this volume going into 2024.
Yeah, I think that's just been the concern with Michael Pittman, especially this last few years. This last year, 99 receptions, and yet he didn't even have 1,000 yards.
Right.
He is in this role. He's kind of like a Deontay Johnson, except he's 6'4", 225. So you want him to, go down the field and make a big catch. He just hasn't been that. And you were kind of hoping, hey, Shane Steichen coming in, maybe we see him down the field a little bit. We didn't. Like you said, the ADOT was super low. You just never saw that from him. And his career high in touchdowns is 6. He's had 4 each of the last 2 seasons.
Right.
So I hope he stays in Indianapolis, and I hope he's able to, find his way down the field a little bit more with Anthony Richardson, a guy who kind of showed, he's willing to air it out.
He has arm.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so that's my hope for him, is that you can just move it a little farther. Because if you move that ADOT from 8 yards and all of a sudden you're at like 10, 11, and he gets the same amount of targets, receptions might come down a little bit, but also the fantasy points are so much bigger for Michael Pittman. So I think exactly what you said. It's just the efficiency of him being able to get, to a top 5 guy at his current pace. He would need like 160 receptions, so
yeah,
it's just you're just hoping for a little bit more down the field.
I mean, 4 receiving touchdowns, right? You touched on it, Lucas. That's something that we want to see jump up to more than 6 if that's his career high, right?
Right.
And there's some kind of hope, I guess, right? You get Anthony Richardson back fully healthy. You're going to get a full season of Jonathan Taylor. Then, like, maybe this offense becomes even more efficient going into next year, and that means more scoring opportunities. But then the question that we have to ask ourselves is, are they really actually going to throw him more in those scenarios when you've got a running quarterback like Anthony Richardson and Jonathan Taylor still in the backfield? So it's going to be a fascinating debate to see how many people think, or, to see who believes that Michael Pittman can do better in that touchdown category than he did really his entire career so far.
Yeah. And he is unrestricted free agent, so he could be, wherever next year too. That's another big consideration.
I mean, and I agree with your sentiment, Cameron, I really do hope he stays in Indianapolis, because I do think they can build something out with this offense there if they do bring Michael Pittman back, with Anthony Richardson coming back next year. I think he's worth keeping around to continue building this Indianapolis Colts offense for the years to come with Shane Steichen. Let's get Anthony Richardson some stability, and let's not make Shane Steichen try and figure things out with new weapons. I would like to see him stay in Indianapolis, but that will be determined this off season. Let's move on to 12. We got to keep things moving here. We got quite a few more wide receivers to cover. Look, this is a guy I take a lot of pride in enjoying this year. And Ty, while you give us the good and bad and the ugly, I'm going to go ahead and take a victory lap now that I have a ginormous room to do so in.
Nico Collins, ladies and gentlemen, finished as a top 12 wide receiver on the year. He was, Cam, you can maybe differ.
Come on now.
I think all 3 of us were really in on Nico Collins as like the late round wide receiver to target in every draft.
No, you both were in on him too.
We were, but
I wasn't quite as much. I'll admit it. I was a John Mechie believer, and I was very wrong. So I'll give it to you too.
Yeah. Well, and Lucas had the room to victory lap. I'm kind of coffin cornered here in my own little setup, but
I'm tripping over boxes that are unpacked behind me.
So look, the good for Nico Collins, top 10 in yards after the catch, receiving yards, fantasy points per game, yards per reception, yards per route run, yards per reception. That's kind of confusing that I put them literally back to back in the doc, but fantasy points per route and fantasy points per target, kind of similar to Deebo Samuel in the way where it was just efficiency and big plays and ample touchdown numbers, right? The bad for Nico Collins, we're going to be picking, we're splitting hairs here. We're going to get real nitpicky, because for a guy that was going as late as Nico Collins was there really any bad? And like the only bad that I could find was that he had 4 games with less than 7 fantasy points, but 3 of those, all of them happened before fantasy playoffs. He missed the first week of fantasy playoffs. So maybe you didn't go far in your playoffs because you didn't have a Nico Collins available. But that was really about it. Like it was, the 4 games. One of those games is the game that he left early because it was the Jets game. So it was like, I guess it's 2 technically. He didn't play in 1, got injured super early in that Jets game. So it's really just 2 games. And the ugly is kind of what I just said about the bad. Like, is there really anything ugly for a guy that was taken that late in drafts? Like, sure, I think the only thing, the only ugly is that maybe this season is a bit of a facade. a little bit. The guy had caught almost like, what was it, 74% of his targets? That's unreal. That's unreal. Only 29 of his targets were not caught.
Yeah.
And the only wide receiver that I could find in like the last 5 years who's like in the 20s of targets not caught was Hunter Renfrow in 21. That was it. That's it. So
that dude plays in the slot. That's not even that impressive.
Right. So I think
it is, but
yes, it still is. I think when I say facade, I mean more so like we saw a hyper efficient offense in Seattle last year, and then we saw it in the second year where there was a massive dip in efficiency when it came to the passing game. And I kind of worry that could happen to Houston. You know, we can give the argument that, oh, the film is out now and teams know how Houston wants to play and all that kind of stuff. But it was Nico Collins, arguably the biggest, the best value in your drafts this year. Top 10 in fantasy points per game, top 12 wide receiver on the year. There's not much bad when it comes to Nico Collins after what we saw this year, though.
So here's what I'll say the ugly is for Nico Collins, because I would agree with you for where you got him. And if we're evaluating this from a fantasy football perspective, there's really not a lot of ugly and things you can complain about with Nico. The ugly is that he's just bad on the road. Like things did not go his way when he was on the road this year. I mean, you look at him in home games, 9 home games, 55 receptions for 906 yards. We're talking about a nearly 1,000-yard receiver at home this year. He's averaging 100 yards per game at home. Like, that is absurd. Caught 7 touchdowns. 7 of his 8 touchdowns were at home. Then you look on the road, right? Played 6 games at home, and I know there's that Jets game in there, right, where it gets a little bit foggy of, okay, could he have had more yards? He technically logged the game, but like only 65 yards per game on the road, only 1 receiving touchdown on the road. So part of me is like, that's par for the course, right? Like, especially with rookie CJ Stroud, let's get him under the home lights. Let's get him with the home crowd. He'll play a lot better there. I think that's just kind of par for the course, but I would say for me, that's the ugly, is that you could almost kind of pick and choose when you wanted to play Nico. If he was on the road, you know what, he might not be your best option, but if he's at home, you better fire him up, because that dude could drop you 100 and a touchdown and give you a 20+ point week if he averages 4 or 5 receptions on top of that. So, I mean, all in all, you're right, Ty. There's not a lot of bad you can look at from Nico Collins this year, because he was absolutely phenomenal. He was everything and more than I thought he was going to be this year. And again, this is an offense that we're really going to have to look at closely going into next year, especially with Tank Dell, especially with CJ Stroud in year 2. What are teams going to do to adjust? Is Bobby Slowick going to be around? Is he going to go be a head coach now as well? Like, what's going to happen here? There's going to be a lot to track there this offseason. Cameron, anything you want to chip in here before we get to 11?
Yeah, that's all I was going to say, is that there's going to be a lot of changes happening. It'll be interesting how drafts shake out. Like, are people going to value Tank Dell higher because of he was just that big flash in the pan that got hurt? Are they going to discount him, valuing Nico really high? Dalton Schultz, is he going to be back? Are they going to rely on Devin Singletary? There's just so much facets of their offense that are probably going to change this next season that it'd be really interesting just to see what it's even going to look like next season, much less like how everyone's going to perform.
Right. And we'll track that as we go throughout the offseason. That's why you should make sure you're following us on our socials. FFL is on Twitter, the FFL is on Instagram, Fantasy Football Fellas, Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, and here on the pod and YouTube, obviously. We'll be tracking all that as the season goes on, as the offseason goes on here, excuse me. But Cameron, let's get to 11 here. I think this player season could have gone a lot better. Still plenty of good, but man, the bad and the ugly here are really what brings this star player down to 11.
Yeah, I honestly think if you take away Cooper Kupp, we might be talking about Jamar Chase as one of the biggest wide receiver busts in the first round. He still had 100 receptions, still had 145 targets, still had 1,216 yards and 7 touchdowns. The problem was, it was just where he was being drafted, right? He was going second. Some people were taking him first, third, right? He was a top 5 pick in every single fantasy draft. And he still had 5, top 12 finishes. But like you said, the biggest thing for Jamar Chase this year wasn't that he looked bad. It didn't look like Jamar Chase took a step back. It was the fact that Joe Burrow played hurt, and then he finally looked decent, and then he got hurt, and then he had Jake Browning. So it was just not great quarterback play, but he still, finished as a wide receiver 1 technically on the season, a wide receiver 11. So I would consider that the good. The bad is the advanced stats were not fun. 24th in target rate, which blew my mind. The fact that he can be that good and he's 24th in target rate, 26th in air yards for a guy you banked on explosive plays, from 82nd in ADOT, 26th in deep targets, 26th in yards per out run, and he's 21st in fantasy yards per out run. And really the biggest part for him was the ugly, was he had 9 games outside the top 30 wide receivers. That is a lot for a guy that you're drafting there. That's Austin Eckler territory.
Right.
And, in the last weeks 14 to 17, he was 50, wide receiver 57, wide receiver 39, did not play, wide receiver 56, wide receiver 59. So he just absolutely killed you in the fantasy playoffs. There was absolutely no help. And he was definitely your wide receiver 1. And he scored 60% of his fantasy points in 5 of his 16 games this year. Right. So when he was great, like he had a 55-point performance, he was phenomenal. But when he wasn't, 40% of his fantasy points were in 11 games. So it's just, it was a lot of boom, but with a lot of bust. And a lot of that, you got to think, came from the quarterback play this season.
I mean, it was kind of a year from hell for the Cincinnati Bengals. When you lose, when Joe Burrow was coming in banged up, obviously not looking good, then he just absolutely, literally mid-game, can't throw a football. Literally can't even hold on to a football. I still think of that clip on the sideline all the time where he's trying to throw it, and literally the ball, he gets to about, if you're watching on YouTube, it's right at the side of his head, and it literally comes out of his hand sideways because he can't hold on to the football. I mean, and Jake Browning did what he could. Man, he gave Jamar Chase some relevancy at points, but part of me is you know what? Dump it, scratch it, throw it out. It's garbage. Jamar Chase will be fine, but it really was just so much bad this year. And the ugly just made everything worse. But I don't think that's going to be what's going to be par for the course.
No, and it'll be really interesting going into next year with drafts of where does he go, right? Does he maintain this top 5, or are we going to be seeing him in the same range we saw Ceedee Lamb this last year? If we see him in the same range we saw Ceedee Lamb, we could see a very similar, path where you're at the end of the first round, you get a guy who could average 28.5 fantasy points per game down the stretch. So, I think next year will be interesting to see if he gets bumped down. He shouldn't, if Burrow's back healthy, but fantasy community is very temperamental, that's for sure.
Temperamental is a great word, because I think if he's anywhere outside of the top 5, I'm going to be all over it. Ty, anything you want to add on to this Jamar Chase dumpster fire at all?
It's not even a Jamar Chase thing. I'm just curious to see what happens with T. Higgins.
Yeah.
Yes,
if he
that's
leaves,
the other thing.
Well, and it's not just T. Higgins, Tyler Boyd too. Tyler Boyd, I think, has 1 year, but they save $6 million cap space if they let him go. So for all we know, if they let both walk, it could be Jamar Chase. And if that happens and he's still going into Ceedee Lamb range, you can count me in that Jamar Chase is going to be the most drafted wide receiver for my teams next year.
I mean, I just don't think we can forget how elite of a talent this guy is.
Yes.
That's
100%.
He is still talented. You read the box score stats for how good they still were, despite how awful the season was for the Cincinnati Bengals. That should give you more than enough hope and affirmation that Jamar Chase will be just fine going into next year. This is a dump it, trash it year. Things will improve next year. I don't think this will be the new norm for Jamar Chase. Let's take a quick break before we get into the top 10 wide receivers here. I'll hear from our friends over at Underdog Fantasy. Today's podcast episode is brought to you by our friends over at Underdog Fantasy. Now, we love Underdog. It is the easiest place to play best ball formats, and they even have their own form of player props called Pick'em. You can make up to 20 times your money on a single night by correlating props together. 2 picks will triple your money, 3 will 6 times it, 4 will 10 times it, and 5 plays that all hit will multiply your entry by 20. You can even place insurance on your picks too, so if only 4 of your 5 props hit, you still get 10 times your entry. And if you use our code FELLAS when signing up, Underdog is going to double your first deposit up to $100. Alrighty, we are back. Man, it's been a while since I've done that. That was fun. We're going to get through the top 10 wide receivers from the 2023 fantasy football season. The good, the bad, and the ugly. We're going to keep it chugging here, fellas, because we only got 30 minutes. Wide receiver 10 on the year. I can't believe he was the wide receiver 10 still. I'm going to be perfectly honest with you. When I was going through this list and I saw I had to talk about Davante Adams, my first thought, no joke, was, holy crap, he was still the top 10 wide receiver. Because look, I mean, he salvaged his season by being an alpha, like a pure alpha, and that's the good. That's literally the only good you can look at from this year. 175 targets, 33% target share, 31.1% targets per route run, meaning he was targeted on just over 31% of his routes. Those were all second in the league this year. And that's what salvaged Davante Adams' season. Because the bad is I can't even like contribute some of the ugliness. I should really start with the ugliness, but the bad is that his quarterback play was Jimmy Garoppolo, Aiden O'Connell, and Brian Hoyer. Like, who else had worse quarterback? Did anybody have worse quarterback play this year? Was it the Jets?
Vikings look like a bunch of Pro Bowlers.
It was awful. That's the bad. So you can't really fault Davante Adams for that. But you look at the ugly. Oh my gosh, where do we even want to begin with this? The metrics were just down across the board this year. I mean, 1,100, 100, oh my goodness, 1,144 yards. I can't even spit that number out. That was the fewest since 2017, where he played at least 14 games. He only played 12 games in, I believe it was 2018, if I'm remembering my numbers correctly, but in 14 plus games played, 1,144 yards. That is the fewest since 2017 for Davante Adams. 8 receiving touchdowns. That's the fewest since 2015 with the same parameters. 11.1 yards per reception, fewest since 2015. Under 2 yards per route run, 1.97. That is the fewest since 2017. And his yards after catch, only 337. Davante kind of been sitting somewhere between that 450 to 550 range over the past few years. But again, the fewest since 2017. And look, the dude he absolutely vanished in weeks 5 through 9. And that's when people really were just like, I'm done, crash it. I want nothing to do with Davante Adams anymore. He was the wide receiver 64 in fantasy points per game. Wide receiver 45, wide receiver 69, nice. Wide receiver 24, the wide receiver 100, and the wide receiver 45 in those games. I mean, he went absolutely vanished. It was nowhere to be found. He scored less. This sums it up. He scored less fantasy points than Jake Bobo. Fantasy points per game. Less than Jake Bobo, Josh Reynolds, DJ Chark, Khalil Herbert, and Brandon Powell during that stretch.
Khalil Shakir.
Did I say Herbert?
Yeah.
I thought about it, and then I kept going. Khalil Shakir, because I was on a roll.
Sorry.
Khalil Shakir. No, you're good. That was a good catch. That was a good catch. Look, he scored less fantasy points per game than all those dudes. That's the ugly for Davante Adams. Not career worst, but like Davante Adams out of the last 7 years, this is his worst year by far. And it's not even close. And yet somehow he managed to be top 10. And that's the thing with Davante Adams. Unless if his quarterback play improves, I'm worried this is the new normal for Davante Adams. And when we get more guys who are healthy, when we get guys who get their quarterbacks back, how far does Davante Adams fall down the chain? I think he was lucky to salvage a top 10 season this year.
Yeah, I'd agree.
I mean, Cameron, you had him on your dynasty team, and you felt this the entire
I know it was a tough year. Yeah, over the last 2 years, he's had 375 targets. That's the most of any wide receiver the last 2 years. He has caught 203 of them. 375 targets. He has caught 203. That's 57% catch rate. That is the lowest of any wide receiver with at least 200 targets over the last year. And last season was 100 receptions on 180 targets. This year, 103 receptions on 175 targets. He has been the worst 2 years in a row at a catch rate, and it has a lot to do with quarterback play. It has a lot to do with the fact that they throw it to him, and it's nowhere near him, 80% of the time. So it's good to see that they're at least continue to try to throw him the ball. They just need somebody who can actually, get the job done.
Deliver him the ball.
Yes.
Right. That's the big thing. Ty, you just breathed a very heavy sigh because why?
Well, you guys remember at the beginning of the season when Jacoby Myers was kind of a thing?
Yeah.
I feel like, it was kind of a disappointing season because I don't know how good the outlook can be for a guy that's going on his 31st year. With a team that seems comfortable to ride with Aiden O'Connell still somehow, some way. Like, I don't know. And the last piece of the puzzle, they currently don't have an offensive coordinator. Okay. But here are the guys that they have scheduled interviews with.
Oh gosh, I don't want to know this list.
Alex Van Pelt, the former Browns offensive coordinator.
champion.
Okay.
Who let over the his last 3 positions. He was a quarterback's coach in Green Bay from 2014 to 2017. He was a quarterback's coach in Cincinnati from 2018 to 2019, and then they fired him, and that was when they brought in Joe Burrow. And then he was the offensive coordinator in Cleveland and quarterback's coach from 2020 to 2023. So there is nothing really substantial in his last decade of work. Dan Pitcher, Bengals quarterback's coach, which I get it. It's Joe Burrow. But at the same time, we just saw a quarterback's coach become an offensive coordinator in a much better offense in Philadelphia. And look how that turned out. The guy doesn't even have his job anymore. Then the last guy, we kind of joked about this earlier.
Gosh. No, this is Davante Adams' downfall.
Yeah.
If Luke freaking Getsy gets hired. Oh my gosh.
Luke Getsy. How it doesn't look like it's going to get much better for the guy. And it stinks because the talent that's Davante. And like I said, it's the quarterbacks, it's the potential offensive coordinators are going to have next year. It's not looking great for Davante, let's be honest.
So let's move on to number 9 then, because I similar boat.
Yeah.
I mean, similar boat. The thing is, Stefon Diggs at least started the year off really hot. He was a wide receiver 1 through the first at least 4 or 5 weeks of the season. It's phenomenal. But then, my gosh, I don't know what in the world happened. There needs to be a case study on this, because Stefon Diggs still the wide receiver 9 on the year, but break down the good, the bad, and the ugly here, Ty. And I'm guessing we're going to spend a lot of time on the ugly.
Yeah, so I'll just kind of blow through the good and the bad first. But he was 6th in targets and receptions on the year, even with his second half performance. He did put up over 150 targets again. That's a 4th straight season of that for Stefon Diggs. The bad, he was 31st in yards per route run. Not super great. He was 51st in fantasy points per target. That's not great also, but here's where the discussion really starts. I can't even say it starts because I don't even know where to start when it comes to the ugly for Stefon Diggs. The fact that he had more finishes outside the top 45 with 6 than finishes inside the top 10 with 5. Or that he averaged 9.8 fantasy points per game from week 10 until the end of the season. Wide receiver 44, wide receiver 46 in fantasy points per game, after averaging 21.5 the first 9 weeks, where he was the wide receiver 3 and the wide receiver 4 in points per game. Yeah. It's I don't think I've ever seen such a dramatic fall from grace than what Stefon Diggs went through this year. And maybe you chalk it up to the change in play caller from Ken Dorsey to Joe Brady. I don't know if that's the complete picture or complete answer for you. We just saw it in this Kansas City Buffalo playoff game. There's a disconnect between Josh Allen and Stefon Diggs right now. And we can get into the debate of whose fault it is, but we all know who the real diva is between the two of those guys, because it's been going on for the past 4 off seasons. Literally. And now people are starting to plead to get him out of Buffalo because apparently,
it's too much.
Tracking a deep ball is now Josh Allen's fault when it's breadbasket. I don't know. Stefon Diggs is going to be an interesting one last year. How much of a recency bias is his ADP going to be next year? Who's going to be the offensive coordinator? Because who knows? Maybe Buffalo doesn't bring back Joe Brady. Who knows? Maybe they keep him there. Who knows? But Stefon Diggs, probably the biggest reason why your team did not succeed in fantasy this year, even after such an incredibly hot start to the year.
Yeah, I'd be shocked if they don't bring Joe Brady back, because that Bills team was the hottest team in the NFL going into that Kansas City game. And they could have won it if it weren't for a missed field goal. They had a chance to win that game. So I think Joe Brady is still probably going to be the guy there with a good offense as a team's offensive coordinator. The thing you have to point out with Stefon Diggs, Ty, you nailed it. Week 9 is where it fell off, because before then, Diggs only had 2 games with less than 11 targets the first 8 weeks. Then after that, he only had 2 games with more than 10 targets. I mean, the targets dipped to 7, 5, 8, 11, 11, 5, 8, 7, 8. And you know what? 8's a pretty good number. Yeah, it ain't 12, 13, 14 like he's normally commanding. That's the thing. And if he's not even getting the volume, not even getting the opportunity to catch passes, it's just not going to equate to anything. And those receiving numbers, my God, they are just, I can't look at the webpage anymore. Look, Cameron, anything you want to hop on here? Because, I mean, that's the story of Stefon Diggs. It was a tale of two halves of the season, and one was one heck of a lot better than the other.
Yeah, I mean, the only person that probably has a close, fall off to that is Travis Kelce this year as well. We saw a huge fall off there, but Diggs and Adams are going to be in pretty not similar situations, because Diggs has Josh Allen and Davante Adams has Aiden O'Connell, but from the fact of, Diggs can be 31 next year, Adams will be 32. The cap hit for a dead cap on Davante Adams is $44,000. Diggs is $31,000, right? Those are tough contracts to move if they want out. It's going to be really hard to force your way out if you do want out. So there's just a lot of factors at play for both of these guys that it's going to be really interesting just to see, the offseason saga. How does it look? What all is all going to happen? Because, Diggs is signed through 2027, Adams signed through 2026. So these guys are supposed to be connected to these places for a while. They got a lot of money tied up in that.
Let's move on to number 8. Speaking of teams that are going to have plenty of questions of what they're going to do with their weapons this offseason, I think we can add Keenan Allen to that list as well with the San Diego Chargers. Not quite Los Angeles Chargers, formerly San Diego Chargers. Let's talk about Keenan Allen. And Cam, if you want to take a quick victory lap here, you can go ahead and do a spin in your chair, do whatever you want, because you were the main proponent of Keenan Allen on this show this offseason. But let's talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly here. Because for most of the year, I mean, Keenan was phenomenal, and the not to spoil your ugly, but the ugly is that he just missed the tail end of the year, and you were spoiled of a potential league winner like we predicted.
Yeah, him and Joe Mixon really have been my guys, and Keenan Allen and I didn't back off this year. I backed off Joe Mixon a little bit. Have been my guys since we started this podcast, really. And so it's just fun to see. But yeah, like you said, he only played 13 games. He had 108 receptions, 150 targets. Would have been first in both if he would have, kept up that streak through the end of the season. 21.5 fantasy points per game. He was a wide receiver 3 in fantasy points per game, behind only Tyreek Hill and Ceedee Lamb. In the 12 games with Justin Herbert, he averaged 8.5 receptions, 11.5 targets, 97 yards, and 0.6 touchdowns for 22.2 fantasy points per game. And he was a wide receiver 2. Right. I mean, the dude was phenomenal when he was on the field. The bad is he finished with 5 weeks outside the top 25, but he did have 7 weeks inside the top 12 to kind of balance it out. So it was a couple little more rough weeks, but the ugly, like you said, is just that he didn't play. And it's tough because that's always been the thing with Keenan Allen. Oh, he's injury. We got to be concerned about injuries. And part of it was Justin Herbert was out there, nothing to play for. It sounded like Keenan could have came back if Herbert's still in, but there's no reason to push a guy who's 31 years old to play 3 meaningless games at the end of the year, especially if you're either looking to, maybe, trade him if you want him to play on your team. You want him to be healthy going into next year. So that was just a tough end of the season. But yeah, when him and Herbert were on the field at the same time, 22.2 fantasy points per game. There's literally nothing more you could ask for from a mid 4th round pick for when he was on the field. Going into next year, like you said, it's going to be interesting with his contract, Mike Will's contract. Mike Will be back. What they decide to do, they're obviously going to go in a new direction from Brandon Staley. So there's a lot of moving pieces to this team. But as far as this year, when Keenan Allen was about as good as you could ask for when he was out there.
I mean, just volume king. I mean, that was the name of his game. I mean, he's like Michael Pittman Jr. is like Keenan Allen light, if you really want to think about it that way. Because Keenan Allen, the clear alpha, clear peppered with targets in that offense. He was a lot of fun to have, but yeah, you got spoiled of a league winner. We're just going to be honest about it. You got spoiled of a league winner, just like we predicted at the start of the year. I don't know how much more we can really add on to that, Ty. Is there anything you wanted to chip in?
I guess just kind of a recap of the last 3 guys, Davante Adams, Stefon Diggs, Keenan Allen, and probably the next guy that we're going to talk about. There's a changing of the guard happening with these wide receivers because we're getting older, we're getting quarterback situations and all that kind of stuff. But it's sentimental, it's emotional Keenan Allen, Stefon Diggs, and Davante Adams have been good for so long, and it's all going to change going into next year.
Yeah, let's talk about the next guy at 7. Mike Evans was the wide receiver 7 this year. Look, the good with Mike Evans, another 1,000-yard season. Put him in the rafters at this point. 10th straight season, hasn't had less than 1,000 yards in any season of his career. He was another 12-plus touchdown season this year. It's his 5th of his career, and he was first in all air yards this year. Mike Evans was used down the field. He's used as an end zone threat. He was heavily involved in the bad. Like, I feel like I really feel bad calling this a bad, but just looking at, what 2015, 2016 Mike Evans demanded, 136 targets was 16th of all wide receivers this year. Considering Chris Godwin is the wide receiver 2, and that's no knock on Chris Godwin, but Mike Evans is clearly better than Chris Godwin right now. I feel like he should be able to command more than 136 targets, but hey, you know what? Top 10 numbers, 12 touchdowns. I'm not going to complain about it because that's what you've always gotten from Mike Evans in his career. And look, the ugly Mike Evans, it's what we've always known about him. He's going to bail you out with the touchdowns. He had 66 or less receiving yards in 9 of 17 games this year, and he had 4 less receptions in 8 of 17. I look again for a guy who's going to be an alpha who I want to try and command 12, 13 targets a game. I want to see those numbers higher. I don't want to have to worry about being bailed out on touchdowns in every game. But again, that's just who Mike Evans is as a player, and that's why we do these recaps, right? We can say like, you know what, he did it again. Maybe that's just who Mike Evans is, and we just can't hope for another 160 plus target year for Mike Evans, but. It's the things that will point out the trends that we've been seeing. We won't call it good. It's a downfall, but yeah, the ugly is that, man, he's really bailing you out on touchdowns, and you really got to hope those touchdowns keep coming along. But Mike Evans has also proven that he can do it throughout his entire career.
Yeah, I'd say the real ugly for Mike Evans, and this doesn't have to do with fantasy, it's the drops. I mean, this dude, unlike anyone I've ever seen, he just, it hits him in the hands, he'll drop 3 in a row, and then one hand falling back and hit in the middle of it, and he makes that. It's the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen. But yeah, there's not much more you could ask for Mike Evans.
No, literally not much more you can ask from Mike Evans, and I didn't even think about the drops. I was crunching box. I was crunching advanced.
No, it really doesn't have to do with fantasy. It's just
no, but you're 100% right, because it's killer. Because you know what? In some of those games where he did have less than 66 receiving yards, I guarantee you he snags one of those, and you know what? You're like, hey, you know what? Wasn't as bad of a week as it could have.
Yeah, for sure.
But let's move on to number 6. And I can't believe it that DJ Moore finished as a top 7 wide receiver this year. It kind of makes me sick, Ty. I don't know about you. Give us the good, the bad, and the ugly here, because I think a lot of people are anti DJ Moore because they're like, oh, he had 2 big games, man. He got carried the rest of the season. I get it. There was a 3-game stint with Tyson Bagent, but outside of that, like, DJ Moore looked the part this year.
He did. And it was kind of strange because I remember when the trade with Carolina happened in the offseason, and everyone's like, that DJ Moore piece is so critical for Chicago. And I was like, at that point, I never really thought of DJ Moore as like the game changer that everyone talked him to be.
And AJ Brown, right.
Right. And he showed it this year. So I'm just going to zip my trap when it comes to that, and just recognize talent and the fact that he made this offense 10 times better than it was the year before. He was top 10 receiving yards after the catch, in touchdowns, air yard share. Most, when the ball was being thrown, it was going towards DJ Moore. He was a target hog. He was top 10 in target share, weighted opportunity. Yeah, everything. You clearly saw exactly why Chicago went out and asked and got him in that trade with Carolina, because he took the offense to another level. And It's not the first time that we've seen teams with a young quarterback go trade for a stud wide receiver. I mean, we saw Philly do it with AJ Brown. It dramatically improves the output and efficiency of the offense. The bad with DJ Moore really is just that he was 30th in targets per route run. So I think that's more of an indictment. It's more of an indictment on the system than it was anything between Justin Fields or DJ Moore. I just think because if I'm not mistaken, I'm going to try to look up what the team pass plays per game stat was for the Bears. It was not very good from what I remember. Like they like to run the ball, and part of that was
Luke Getsy.
Yeah, Luke Getsy. And the ugly though for DJ Moore is that he just did you no favors in fantasy playoffs. 9.2 in week 15, 4.8 in week 16. And then he did do decently well against Atlanta in week 17, but then in week 18, just 10.5 points. Shane Waldron is now the offensive coordinator in Chicago. That makes it interesting. We all know the quarterback situation in Chicago is going to be a topic of discussion for the entire offseason until we get to the draft. Caleb Williams, Justin Fields. We know that he has been very vocal for Justin Fields. It's going to get really interesting if Chicago doesn't go with Justin Fields. But like I said at the very beginning, for all of you that had questions exactly like how good DJ Moore was, just because, you know, he had the Carolina impact, I'll call it. He showed you that he is still that he is actually one of the better wide receivers in the league. It should be most, close to top 10 wide receivers in drafts next year because this offense is built for DJ Moore to succeed.
Yeah, I'd agree.
So that's the thing with DJ Moore, though. Like all these players, it seems like thus far, so many moving pieces. Is it Justin Fields or Caleb Williams? If it's not Caleb Williams, it's going to be Marvin Harrison Jr. I find it hard to believe Chicago trades any further than 3. So is it DJ Moore and Marvin Harrison Jr.? What does that mean then?
Yeah.
And if it is Caleb Williams, is DJ Moore still like he's going to be the one, but how is Caleb Williams going to succeed? Is there going to be growing pains?
Yeah.
Shane Waldron. What is this like? Luke Getsy, sure. Yeah, not the greatest offense in the world. Shane Waldron likes to play with pace, but what does that do for DJ Moore? And I'm not saying Shane Waldron is the biggest what if here, but it's another piece of the puzzle that we have to put together and be ready to evaluate properly this offseason, along with literally the other laundry list of things the Chicago Bears have.
Yeah, I think as long as it's not Marvin Harrison, I think he's going to be fine. Because you think about it, if it is Caleb Williams, Justin Fields was under 200 yards passing a game this season on 60% completion percentage, right? Caleb Williams isn't going to do worse from a passing perspective for DJ Moore this next year. But if it is Marvin Harrison and Justin Fields and DJ Moore, then, it really could be pretty interesting this next year.
Gosh, I just have an aneurysm every single time I see a Chicago fan go, we want Marvin Harrison. We'll keep Justin Fields. Caleb Williams is better than Justin Fields is right now. I just need to say it. Okay. And I swear if it's not, if they do trade back and take Marvin Harrison, I'm going to be
I know your frustration with that. I agree with you. I think they should still take Caleb Williams number 1 and trade Justin Fields, but there's also like a legitimate culture chemistry building piece that might actually be worth more than the analyst wants to give it credit for in terms of keeping Justin Fields around, to which in that case you throw in Marvin Harrison into that to add another weapon. Or maybe Brian Poles just does something absolutely ludicrous and trades down to like 7 or 8 with an Atlanta team and takes more offensive line, takes more defensive pieces, and accumulates even more future draft capital, which frankly might not even be the worst idea. Sorry, Chicago. Look, Chicago has so much on the laundry list this offseason. I don't think it's worth trying to speculate right now, but the point is DJ Moore came in and he once again proved that in fantasy football, these guys who with high upside, high talent ceilings that get attached to these young blossoming quarterbacks can produce outrageous numbers for fantasy football. And that's what DJ Moore did this year. It's what AJ Brown did. Tyreek Hill, not necessarily young, but when he went to Miami to play with Tua Tagovailoa, we all saw what happened there. I mean, these young quarterbacks who get these stud wide receivers, they give them the numbers. And DJ Moore is just another statistical plot point on that model. Look, we're at the top 5. We really got to fly through these top 5 wide receivers here. And frankly, I don't think we want to spend too much time on these top 5 because we all know how good they are, except for number 4. We might want to spend a little bit more time on him. But A.J. Brown comes in at number 5. Cameron, give us the good, bad, the ugly.
Yeah, this season, 106 receptions, 158 targets, 1,456 yards, and 7 touchdowns. And I think he really established that if there was any thought, that Devonta Smith might start really being like a 1B, like, no, it's A.J. Brown's team. He out-targeted Devonta Smith by 44 on the season. He's a back-to-back top five seasons. He had that stretch from weeks 4 to 9 where he was on fire, finished as top 15 wide receiver, and each week at least 18 fantasy points. But the bad for him is, the touchdowns and the yards per reception came down. He was closer to 13 this year after being close to 18 last season. And I think this just led to, he had 4 single-digit performances, but at the same time, the receptions came up, the targets came up. So it kind of, I think, is a good thing. You're not depending on the big play for A.J. Brown quite as much, but I think it does, at the same time, it limited his huge weeks. Because, remember last season, it was just like every other week, it felt like the dude was dropping 30, 35 plus. And then the ugly was he did slow down from weeks 11 to 17. He was the wide receiver 24 in that stretch with only 12.3 points per game and only 1 touchdown. He had less receptions and yards and touchdowns than Devonta Smith during that time as well. I think that's just one of the ebbs and flows. We talk about these stretches, and sometimes it's just like that's just how the season works out. I don't think that's something that you're going, ooh, A.J. Brown's fallen off, but because the whole Eagles offense, didn't look great the second half of the season. So, like you said, he is elite. He's going to continue to be elite, and if he's going to move more towards more receptions, lower yards per reception, that's probably better from just a consistency standpoint moving forward.
We're going to have to track the Philadelphia Eagles moves throughout the offseason. Again, another team that's just like this offense could change. Mm-hmm. People are talking about A.J. Brown being I think we're getting a little too premature on a lot of that. Like Stefon Diggs, I could see a little bit. He's been there in Buffalo for longer. He's been much more vocal about the state of the team for longer and his role. A.J. Brown's going to be just fine where he is. Jalen Hurts will be back. I don't know what offense the Eagles were running this year. It didn't look like an offense. It was a pathetic offense at that. I think they just have a lot of soul searching to do this offseason, and whoever Nick Sirianni does choose to bring in around him, I really hope, just like when he was hired as the head coach, he can really start building out this team and this offense again. So again, we'll have to see what they do with their coordinator moves this offseason. But yeah, A.J. Brown is one to track. I think he's safely going to continue to be in this top, 5 to 7 realm every single year. But I don't know if we're going to get that top 3 year unless if things really continue to click on offense. He can't have a slump in the second half of the season like he just did this year if he wants to continue being a top 5 guy. It's as simple as that.
For sure.
Let's talk about number 4. He's kind of the odd one out on this list. Puka Nacua, the wide receiver 4 in PPR formats this year. I mean, the good is that he just had the best rookie wide receiver season of all time. What we can't debate that, can we? Like the numbers literally show it. 104 receptions, 1,481 yards, 6 touchdowns. Like those are the best rookie numbers, not touchdowns, but receptions and yards. The most of any rookie wide receiver ever. He ran 2.72 yards per route. That was the 6th best. He was targeted on 29% of his routes, also 6th best. I mean, he's a 1 in LA now. Sorry, Cooper Kupp. It's Puka Nacua. He's the number 1 here now. The bad is he had 10 drops this year. He had the most drops in the league this year. That's something that can be improved upon. But as we look at the bad, that definitely was a part of it. Only 9.1 average depth of target in terms of yards. I was 75th. But again, like a Michael Pittman, he was 639 yards after the catch, which was 5th best in the league. So you make up for it. But again, to see those downfield explosive play opportunities would be nice. But hey, you know what? If this is McVay's offense, it's McVay's offense. But the ugly is, the middle of the season stretch where Cooper Kupp came back, where Matthew Stafford was injured, where he ran into Dallas, Green Bay, and Cleveland for 3 of those matchups. But in those games, he gave you less than 45 receiving yards and 4 or less receptions in 4 out of 6 of those games. And he only scored once during that stretch as well. But that's the ugly for a guy who just had the best rookie wide receiver season ever. Is it crazy that I called him the wide receiver 1 in LA moving forward?
I mean, it sure looked like it this year.
I don't think maybe not crazy. Am I jumping the gun? That's what I'll say.
I don't know if he's going to be clearing away alpha, right?
Yeah.
I think
Sure,
Kupp still got
sure.
something left in the tank.
Yep.
But fantasy point wise, he definitely could be next year.
Yeah, I part of me believes that Cooper Kupp was not at 100% at all this past year.
Yep.
So you get a full off season with those two. I think this offense is 1A, 1B between their two stud wide receivers instead of Philly that is clearly 1 and 2.
Yeah, I think if Kupp does come back and he's 100% and he is the alpha next year, I think Puka Nacua still has a very, very good fantasy role in this offense. As long as Matthew Stafford is back. If it's someone else, then we have question marks. But as long as Stafford's back, I don't think it matters. I mean, obviously it matters, but I think he's good even if Kupp is 100%.
Yeah, and I'll my last point with Puka. He's going to be one of the safest plays next year. He's going to have one of the safest floors of all wide receivers. I like the stretch of the year where he was, in his down games and stuff. He wasn't the only one that was struggling. The entire Rams offense struggled because they're down Matt Stafford, they're down Kyron Williams, not 100% Cooper Kupp, right? Like the entire offense struggled. And when they are fully healthy, they are a well-oiled machine. We saw that against Detroit. So he is going to be one of the safest players next year in fantasy.
Yeah.
I mean, let's move on to the Lions because the number 3 wide receiver on the year in PPR formats was Amon-Ra St. Brown. Ty, I know I did this right up here before I kicked it over to you. Do you want to cover it? You want me to fly through it here? Because, I mean, the definition of Amon-Ra was consistency this year.
I will just fly through it myself. Almost 120 receptions, over 1,500 receiving yards, 10 touchdowns. Everyone, I think we all had an inkling of a hint that he was going to be the only guy in this offense. And it was solidified this year. I mean, it's happened the past 2 years now. But with how efficient, how explosive this offense is, he's by far one of the best assets to have in fantasy football. He only had 3 games with less than 15 fantasy points, 6 finishes outside of the top 12 wide receivers, 4 outside the top 20. Like, these are consistent numbers. You rarely were let down by Amon-Ra. You rarely lost because of Amon-Ra St. Brown. The bad, we're nitpicking. 14th in routes ran. I'm being top 15 is still very
good,
good.
Right?
Yeah.
It's
23rd in fantasy points. Yeah, 23rd in fantasy points per target. Again, I will just say these are not my notes. These notes were already filled in for me. Shout out to I think that was Cam. Yeah,
that was me. No, it was me. But literally, I'm trying to find the bad, and I'm like,
yeah,
we're nitpicking. We're literally nitpicking here. Like, I don't know. You could literally take the piece of the outside the top 15 and outside the top 20 and put it in the bad and be like, well, it could have been better.
Yeah, right.
Amon-Ra gave you nothing but consistency this year. He was probably one of the most underrated picks you could have made this year.
Yeah, I mean, and for the fact, he was going middle of the second round in drafts this year, and I think I don't know how I can keep Amon-Ra out of my top 6 going into next year. Now, granted,
he's gonna be top 5 for me, easy.
Well, so I should say this. Probably not. He's going to be a first round guy because they are going to lose Ben Johnson. So,
fair enough.
That remains to be seen. But
fair enough. I forgot about that piece.
Yeah. That was like, oh, wait a second. That's a very, very important piece of the puzzle. But look, Amon-Ra St. Brown, like I said, you rarely lost. He rarely let you down this year. He's kind of what you want to look for in a wide receiver. And there's only one of those guys almost every year. And if you got it right, you got it because it was Amon-Ra St. Brown.
Yeah.
We're not going to add anything onto that because that's all there is to Amon-Ra. He pulled through for you when you needed him this year. You were disappointed a handful of weeks, but there was very rarely a week where Amon-Ra St. Brown lost you a week. Maybe one game this year he lost you your week, but otherwise he won you or kept you in games left and right. Number 2 wide receiver on the year, dude. Tyreek Hill sucks.
Yeah.
Man, talk about choking away the number 1 wide receiver on the season. Man, what a bum.
Yeah.
Bum.
Shouldn't have got hurt.
Yeah.
Just be healthier, dude.
Yeah, just be built out of vibranium or something. Have a bionic body or something. My gosh.
What a fool.
What a loser.
Idiot.
Golly, Cameron, just lay the hammer on Tyreek Hill, man.
Yeah, I mean 119 receptions, 170 targets back-to-back years with at least 110 receptions, 170 targets back-to-back years with 1,700 plus yards. This year he decided, you know what, 7 touchdowns and last year, let's go 13 this year.
Oh my gosh.
Weeks 1 through 13, he was wide receiver 1, averaging 26.1 fantasy points per game. That was 4 more than any other wide receiver during that time. And he had as many top 3 finishes this season as he did finishes outside the top 15 with 6. So, I mean, he was absolutely phenomenal. And the bad was that he got injured in week 4, missed week 15. Got injured in week 14, missed week 15. Other than that, there was really no down. He had 1 week with 10 points, which you're like, that's so gross. And week 4, he had 1 week with 12 points. And then obviously the week he got hurt, he had 10. And then I guess he had 1 week with 13. Everything else was 18 above. Had multiple, I think he had 9 or 10 weeks above 25 points this year. It was just an absolutely ridiculous season for Tyreek Hill. And if you're going to doubt him next year, I can't help you. I can't help you.
I can't recommend it.
Yep.
What if Tua Tagovailoa isn't the quarterback?
Then he's probably going to be even better.
I won't necessarily argue with that. Because it honestly could be better than Tua Tagovailoa next year, depending on how the quarterback market shakes out. No, we're not going to add anything onto Tyreek Hill because you know how good he was this year, and we're not going to nitpick the good and bad of Tyreek Hill, just like we're not going to nitpick the good and the bad of Ceedee Lamb, who was the overall wide receiver 1 this year. I mean, this man was incredible. He was incredible this year. This single-handedly brought me back-to-back dynasty championships. I hate to do it, Ty. I'm sorry, but yeah, can't you? How many? Don't talk to me about how many championships you choked away this year. Okay. Ceedee Lamb. I haven't had fun like this on the podcast in a while. Ceedee Lamb, 135 receptions, nearly 1,800 yards, 12 touchdowns. Those were all career highs. He was targeted on nearly 30% of his routes, 2.9 yards per route run. That was 5th. And after the bye from week 18 on, he scored 313.6 fantasy points. That was 28.2 PPR fantasy points per game. That was 106 more fantasy points than the wide receiver 2 Amon-Ra St. Brown. That was 7 more fantasy points per game than the wide receiver 2 Tyreek Hill. I mean, he dominated the second half of the season. He single-handedly brought you home the championship. And the good and the bad and the ugly, they're just kind of one and the same because he got off to a slow start the first 6 weeks of the season. He was a wide receiver 19 in fantasy points per game, averaging less than 15 fantasy points per game. But after that, it was wheels up. He did not look back, and he was by far the best wide receiver in fantasy football this year.
Yeah, it's crazy.
I shouldn't say by far, but you get my
second half of the season. Yeah,
second half of the season he was.
Yeah, it's crazy to think because like we talk about like a lot of these guys' lows, like they have like a 4-week stretch, the wide receiver 36. His low was the wide receiver 19 over averaging 15 fantasy points per game. Like that was his awful. So I mean, yeah, it was a fantastic year by Ceedee Lamb. He's going to be in that conversation with Christian McCaffrey, Justin Jefferson, probably Jamar Chase next year for the first overall pick in your drafts.
Yeah, I think he has inserted himself into that top tier now.
Tyreek Hill should be in there as well. Yeah.
Right, and Tyreek Hill. Right, you have Justin Jefferson, Amon-Ra, Tyreek Hill, and I now think Ceedee Lamb makes himself the 4th person in that list. Ty, you look like you're in distress. Are you still mourning your championship loss at the hands of Ceedee Lamb? It's okay if you are. We can get you help.
Mourning it. You didn't even deserve to be in it.
Says the guy that couldn't even.
Says the guy that should have been in it. All right, you got lucky.
No, that's like a new form of torture for me. It's because. Yes, I lost to Ceedee Lamb, but oh my gosh,
you could there.
Jeez, technical
losing tie.
My gosh, trying to keep up with my mic here. Can't stop moving on me. What's it doing?
No, it's just this came at the detriment of Tony Pollard, and I just don't want to talk about it anymore.
Oh yeah, no, Tony Pollard, we're dead and buried. We're not digging him up anymore.
One does not simply just forget about how bad of a season it was. So just move on.
Wide receiver wise, anything we want to add before we close it out here?
Get me out of here. No.
All right.
Oh wait, best stat of wide receiver not in the top 15. Justin Jefferson played 10 games, 8 full games, still had 1,000 yards receiving, and still was tied for the most 140-yard games this season with 5 of them.
He's really freaking good. Kevin O'Connell has a really good offense.
Yep. All right, that's all I wanted.
FF Fellas on Twitter, the FF Fellas on Instagram, Fantasy Football Fellas, Facebook, YouTube, TikTok. If you're not subscribed to the YouTube channel, make sure you do that. Turn on those notifications as well. We still got content coming to you all off season long. Only one podcast a week now. Only one YouTube video a week. Shorts will be coming out a little bit slower of a rate as well, but we will still have weekly content for you. At least 4 to 5 pieces of content every single week. So there will be no shortage of content for you. If you listen to the podcast, we are grateful for your support over there. Make sure you subscribe and turn on those notifications so you know when all of our new episodes are live. I am at Lucas Wenzel on Twitter, CamLawFFF for Cameron, Tyler _Platt for Tyler. We will see you all next week where we will discuss the good, the bad, and the ugly. The top 10 quarterbacks from fantasy football this year. So until then, stay safe, stay healthy. We will chat with you all next week. Thanks for your support. We'll see you all soon. Deuces.
Deuces.